Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is longtime award-winning journalist Betty Ann Adam. Betty Ann is a 60 Scoop survivor and a member of Fond du Lac, Denesuline First Nation in Saskatchewan. She's also the chair of the 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Saskatchewan. Betty Ann, pleasure to have you join us on the show this week.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
You have, 3 decades plus worth of experience as a journalist. Maybe tell us a little on what originally drew you to reporting.
Oh my. I was amazed when I was volunteering. I was going to university and I was volunteering. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was volunteering at the community access station as a volunteer camera operator. And I worked at 7-Eleven in those days to pay the bill. And when I got to be part of a television production, standing behind a camera and following the director's messages, I realized that there were people who got paid to do that work. I wanted to be one of them. And it was at the time that as a 60 Scoop kid, I was a young adult and I had been for a while rediscovering my birth family. And so I knew that I also wanted to do work that would help me to meet more of my people and get to know who I was as an Indigenous person. And so journalism just the two melded so well because I linked up with Will Campbell and Janice Acus and John Cuthand, a lot of journalists and producers here in Saskatchewan, and did some work with them. And one thing led to another. And throughout it all, I just really felt that I loved the immediacy of the media and its visual and emotional impact. And I did radio too. I just loved all of the various media, and the work allows one to meet so many people. You meet people you never thought you'd meet, and you get personal right away. You just start asking questions, and you can get into people's lives. I love it.
Yeah, it's pretty great work if you can get it. Representation is a thing that a lot of people are talking about nowadays. When you were just starting out 30 plus years ago, how would you describe Indigenous representation in newsrooms?
Yeah, it was pretty sparse, that's for sure. When I started at the Star Phoenix in 1989, they hired me because they wanted to have Indigenous people in the newsroom. They had people who, like Indigenous people, would reach out to the newsroom because it's a good community paper, and they say, why isn't there any Indigenous representation? So they would hire people, and once they'd given them some experience and training, they'd get scooped up by the CBC or others, the Edmonton Journal or wherever, and it was that was the case when I started the newsroom. I was certainly the only Indigenous person in our newsroom. I know the Regina newspaper at that time didn't have any Indigenous people. The other newsrooms, I think there might have been. It was sparse. There weren't a lot of people.
Right. And obviously, like you say, people were reaching out. So what was the coverage of Indigenous stories like at the time? And have you seen that change?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think they tried to do positive stories if they heard about them, but I think that most of the non-Indigenous people who filled the newsrooms didn't have a lot of Indigenous contacts. And so the news, whenever you saw Indigenous people in the news, especially in those days, it was usually court-related stories and crime and things like that. There wasn't a lot of good news coming out of,
No problem. We have lots of those issues these days.
Damn it, I've turned off the sound now. I'm sorry about that. Let me just think. The question was how
I guess if we want to just move on, like, were there challenges that you faced being the only Indigenous reporter around in any newsroom?
Being the only Indigenous person in my newsroom definitely was a challenge in different ways. Like, so for one thing, as I said, I was a 60 scoop person, so I was raised in a white context. And by the time I came to the Star Phoenix, I had been, finding my family and meeting my people a bit, but I still really felt like an outsider in Indigenous circles generally. Here in Saskatoon, it's mostly Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota. There's a lot fewer Dene people. And so I felt a bit like they wanted to assign me to the Indigenous stories, and I didn't feel ready to do that at that point. I hadn't trained as a journalist. I had done some work and they saw some potential, so they gave me that opportunity. But I didn't feel comfortable doing Indigenous stories exclusively because I just really felt at a disadvantage. And I sometimes felt as though Indigenous people that I interviewed expected me to sort of understand them more than I did at that time in the beginning. I did say that I wanted to do general assignment reporting. I really wanted to become established as a journalist generally, not doing only Indigenous stories. And so it was, I did Indigenous stories from time to time, just like anybody else in the newsroom, but I wanted to have a good, well-rounded experience. So sometimes I would see stories that made me feel uncomfortable, but especially in the early years as a junior person in a fairly large newsroom, you don't feel like you can say your piece, but I didn't feel as though I had a lot of influence in that. And yeah, it was a little bit, it was challenging because sometimes you'd see stories and just kind of accept that that's the way they do it. And it's not as if I had a lot of power to change the way the newsroom was happening. And that changed over time. We saw things like when First Nations University established their Indian Communications program, I started getting connected with them, and that was a really encouraging thing for me to be working with Indigenous people who were working in the media. That helped a lot. But I think that it took a long time for things to really change, and we saw stories like the Neil Stonechild thing that really, really shone a harsh light on discrimination that was happening in the community, and those things were taken very seriously. And those things, we started to see some changes with that. At the time, I mean, there were other dreadful stories, like there was a serial killer in Saskatoon I guess that was in the 90s, in the early 90s. John Crawford was his name, and he was responsible for 4 deaths in Saskatoon. And there was criticism for how that was covered, but at the same time, you could kind of see the newsroom was trying to get its head around covering things from a more sympathetic perspective.
Yeah. Betty Ann, we're going to talk more about some of the stories that you've covered and your own story. We just have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Betty Ann Adam. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is award-winning longtime journalist Betty Ann Adam. And Betty Ann, covering stories there in Saskatoon for as long as you did. What are some of the stories that you covered that have really stuck with you over the years?
Well, I remember being at the signing of the treaty land entitlement in the early 1990s, which I remember being aware of the gravity of it, the historic importance of the federal government acknowledging that many Indigenous First Nations had been essentially cheated out of the land that they were entitled to at the time of treaty. They were given smaller reserves, or sometimes land was taken back from them, or they'd crowd a couple of bands together on one reserve. There were all these various things that had gone wrong, and the government was agreeing. They signed a framework agreement to go back and look at how much land had been shorted. I think there were 32 First Nations ultimately that had been shorted land, and so it was really exciting to see this historic wrong being righted, and knowing that Indigenous First Nations people were in a really different position to take advantage of their full ownership of the land, because now people were educated and they had lots more lawyers and business people and university graduates who were in a position to now that they had the money to buy land and to use it for economic development. And we knew that then this would be the beginning of really positive things for Indigenous people in Saskatchewan, which it has turned out to be. So I've loved watching that story over the years, and we continue to see the benefits of that. There were a lot of difficult stories. I spent a lot of years on covering courts, and naturally a lot of that was very difficult. I think of the shooting of Constable Robin Cameron and Mark Bordages by Kurt Dagenet was his name, and that was up in Spiritwood. It was a big story in the summer of 2004 or something like that, and so that was a big story where this guy, there was a manhunt for 11 days while this guy was off in the bush, and then ultimately he was arrested, of course, and then I covered the trial of that, and that was really devastating to have, this woman who was a really bright light and a real wonderful role model and was following a tradition of police work in her family and on her First Nation, and to have lose her in the line of duty was difficult. I was in the Star Phoenix newsroom when my colleague Terry Craig got a call from Neil Stonechild's mother saying that her son had been found frozen to death, and she felt that the police had given it short shrift and that they said he just froze to death for no apparent reason. And I remember my colleague coming back from taking the call and going and talking to the police about it. And it was 10 years later that the whole thing about the Starlight Tours came to light when another man was ejected from a police car in the middle of a cold night, and this happened to him, and it happened the same week that two other Indigenous men were found frozen to death in the same area where he had been dropped off. And so he went to the police and went to the media, and that just exploded into the whole story of the Starlight Tours. And ultimately I covered the inquiry into the death of Neil Stonechild. And so that was another one of those really historic things where the evidence became really very solid, that the allegations that Indigenous people were making about unfairness from the police were being proven out. Those are some of the big ones that I think of. I covered the David Milgaard inquiry. It was like a year and a half every day of this inquiry into this poor young man, 16-year-old man, non-Indigenous, who was convicted of a murder that he didn't commit, spent 23 years behind bars as an innocent man. And his mother, the late Joyce Milgaard, was an astonishing woman who would not give up and continued to draw attention, and ultimately went out and found the killer herself and had to bring the DNA to the authorities. It was an astonishing story. Those are some of the ones that really stand out for me.
No kidding. Those are stories I think that stand out for Canadians all over the place. We're kind of making it seem like you've said so long to reporting, but that's not exactly the case. You're working with a former guest on the show, Connie Walker, on her Stolen podcast. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. Well, it's really wonderful to be part of that team. So Connie, as people know from this show, worked with the CBC for many years and did a series of really groundbreaking stories about missing and murdered Indigenous women. Mm-hmm. And she did a 60s scoop season on finding Cleo, a young 60s scoop girl. And then she left the CBC and went to Gimlet Media, where she produces Stolen. So the first season was about I want to say Jermaine Shiloh,
right,
from down in the United States. She found her, and she did a season on that story, and then after that was this in May, when the news about the unmarked graves in Kamloops broke. There was a lot of many survivors of residential schools and intergenerational survivors, of course, took to social media, and Connie's brother was one of them, who told a story about her father and his experience, which Connie wasn't aware of. And so, being the investigator that she is, she began to investigate his story. And of course, she's in Toronto, and so I am one of her people on the ground. I'm her person on the ground here in Saskatchewan. So I've had the good fortune to interview many of the survivors, the elders who were at school there, and they're talking about their experiences. And Connie's entire team is doing a deep dive into Indian residential schools, St. Michael's from Duck Lake in particular, where her father and uncles and aunts attended. They're looking at all aspects of that experience, and it can be difficult work. There's a lot of sadness, and yet there's also I feel really privileged to be working to help give voice to that profound Canadian Indigenous experience, and being able to tell their stories for listeners, not just in Canada, but the international audience that Connie has. I think it's really an important story to be telling.
Really looking forward to it as well. Betty Ann, more to talk about here. Again, we just have to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Betty Ann Adam. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is longtime journalist Betty Ann Adam. And Betty Ann, we're already running out of time, so I want to get in a couple of other things here, and importantly, your work with the 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Saskatchewan, and a film you recently released about the link between the 60 Scoop and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Can you tell us a bit about that film and the types of links that you did discover?
Right. Well, certainly, let's see where to begin. After the national inquiry, the federal government established a fund pool for projects that would commemorate missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so we had discovered in our work in sharing circles with the 60 Scoop that there were many 60 Scoop survivors who had been raised in white homes, and when they found their families and such, discovered that there had been incidents of, violent deaths, including, missing and murdered Indigenous women in their families. We were actually quite shocked by how frequently we discovered that. So we asked them, we applied to do a project, and they thought that was useful. And so we ended up talking to 5 60 Scoop survivors who had experience of missing and murdered family members in their lives. And so we talked to these 5 people. We found stories. People talked about their experience in the 60s scoop, which was often very difficult. And some people's experience in their 60s scoop families were good. And so that was important to include. But ultimately, there was always, we had several people whose family members, mothers, sisters, had been murdered. And in all of the cases, the people were able to talk about their family experience as children from residential schools, right? It starts with the residential schools, and that was often leading to former students whose children got scooped, and then those same families would have people who were dying in this terrible scourge of MMIW. And we thought it was important that Canadians understand that these things don't happen in silos. All of the issues the negative issues that face Indigenous people can be linked to government policy. And these things came up again and again, and those are some of the main points that we came up with. But it was really wonderful to hear the voices of these women and one man who spoke very eloquently about their experience and the connections. So we created a website. We worked with First Nations University, which created and is hosting a website. It's called Everything is Connected. The film is called Everything is Connected, and that's the name of the website, where 60 Scoop survivors are also invited to share their stories as well if they want to, and families of MMIW. We're hoping to make that a place where people can come together and share their experience and learn, and have it be a resource for, if people want to use the film as a learning resource, that'll be a place as well for them to find more.
Great project, and people can head over to that website and watch the entire film as well. Of course, not the only film that you've been involved in, including a very personal one that we were hoping to talk about, but we're short on time here. But I do want to plug Birth of a Family, your story with Tasha Hubbard. Was there anything, Betty Ann, in 30 seconds, if it's at all possible to...
Birth of a Family was a great experience. It was like, when I see it, it's like seeing the best ever family holiday album that you ever saw. But it was our family being together for the first time. And in fact, this past Christmas, my sister Rose came to Saskatoon, and it was the first Christmas in any of our lives where two of us at least got to be together for Christmas, and she stayed through New Year's. And 60 Scoop people are surviving and thriving, and we're trying to find our way back to family and community, and there are stories of happiness and joy and hope too.
That's amazing. That's great that you were able to get together. And that's Tasha Hubbard's Birth of a Family. You can watch it for free over on the National Film Board website, and we'd recommend you go do that. Betty Ann, thanks so much. Sorry we ran out of time so quick, but appreciate you taking your time here with us this week.
My great pleasure.
And that is all the time we have. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. This episode and all past episodes are also available as podcasts. You'll find those over on our website too. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in to Face to Face. Have a great night. We'll see you back here next week.